So I want to talk a little bit about sort of how we got here and then what we have sort of a three-part plan, but the main focus we're gonna talk about today is the immediate part of our plan. What can be enacted immediately to make the tax system fair for everyone and to prevent some of the biggest spikes that I think people have not only experienced in FY25, but have been experiencing for a number of years now because of some sort of structural challenges in the system. So we're going to focus mostly on that part of the conversation, but again, happy to talk more broadly about some of these other pieces. I know there's a lot of information out there, and a lot of conversations happening, and we want to make sure that people have up-to-date and accurate information to share. So I'm going to share my screen. And then I'm going to make sure that I can see what I need to see here. So let me just, so like I say, I want to kind of acknowledge a little bit about sort of where we are in this conversation and what kind of happened to make the FY25 perfect storm. I think a lot of you probably have been following this conversation and recognize that a lot of the costs that came up in FY25 and that drove some of the bigger budget increases and the bigger tax bill increases that we've seen for a while, largely out of district control. I think the Agency of Education really talked about four main drivers. One was healthcare for teachers, one was other increases related to inflation, cost for food and various other things. The third was the loss of the federal ESSER funds. So some of these costs had already hit in FY25, but because of the federal ESSER funds, which was the additional support for public schools from the COVID relief packages, that some of that was sort of muted in FY24 and fully hit in FY25. And then the fourth thing was a pretty big increase, and especially in some districts more than others, increase in the demand for mental health services for kids. A lot of that coming out of the pandemic, but not going away anytime soon either. So I just want to start with kind of ground us in a little bit of history. I think we're going to spend a lot of it today talking about where the system needs improvement and needs some structural reform. But I want to just remind us of also what's good and equitable about the system and which pieces, as we're talking about reforms, what really should be focused on is what should be preserved. So I know a lot of you are familiar with the Brigham case that really set up the funding system that we have now, which is a statewide funding system, one of only a few states where there's a statewide funding system, and we pool and share all the resources. And I use these quotes just to illustrate the fact that the Brigham case was really about equal access to resources. That was the focus of the case, and that's what led us to the system that we have now. So again, sort of acknowledge that these are kind of the principles that came out of that decision and that what the system were based on, these kind of fairness to students, so equal access to resources, fairness for taxpayers, what you get for your money in one town is what you should get for your money in another town, and then the local control or local responsibility aspect of this. So really kind of centering local control and local involvement in schools. So again, I was saying to Sarah and Becca, I usually hate slides that have a lot of words on them, but bear with me here because I'm not sure there's a better way to do this. So just kind of focus on what our system does well and kind of remind us what our system does well and what's worth preserving. The first is this balance between state and local control. Again, a statewide pot, so all the kids have access to that same pot, but local engagement and local school boards and voters are really deciding on how to spend and what to do with that money and what they want their schools to look like. And I think the big leap forward for the system was really narrowing the disparity from town to town, which we were able to do, and we have less disparity from town to town than a lot of other states who are still sort of struggling to figure this out. Some of them still dealing with court cases around a similar kind of thing, which is that the schools are, inequitable and that they're not, there's a variation in quality and opportunity and resources from town to town. The third, again, is this fairness to taxpayers aspect of it. All towns pay the same rate for the same per pupil spending. Your residential tax dollars by the same amount in every town. The fourth is that most taxpayers can pay their school taxes based on income. And I think that's a central part. That's the best measure of anybody's ability to pay. And so it's really centered on that, whereas most systems in the rest of the country are still wholly property-based and much more unfair than ours. But part of what we're going to talk about is the ways in which that's been eroded a bit over time, and that's part of what our solution and our plan is for immediate and permanent sort of structural reform to the funding system. And then the last thing is that per pupil spending is adjusted in multiple ways to kind of smooth cost differences across districts. There's a real recognition at the state level that not all costs are equal. Some districts have to spend a lot more on transportation or other things, and so we do some smoothing of that at the state level to make it more fair. But that also is an ongoing challenge, right, that we have to keep doing. So where the challenges are, we're going to talk about these cliffs that are built into the system that can cause bills to spike for certain taxpayers in any given year. And that's regardless of what's happening with the school budgets, right? Some people they cross a threshold and their school tax bill spikes. The second is that middle class Vermonters are paying the biggest share of their incomes in school taxes. And there's two pieces to that, right? The good news of that is that at the low end, we've done a really good job managing school taxes for low and moderate income Vermonters with income sensitivity. But the bad news is on the high end, the system is still regressive, meaning that once you're paying based on property, the highest income Vermonters with the highest incomes who are paying based on property tend to pay a smaller share of their income in school taxes. So still regressive at the top end. The fourth is sort of, I kind of have this on both slides because I think it's both it's both something that we try to address in an equitable way, and it's something that we haven't quite solved, which is this problem of certain costs hitting certain districts harder than others. And we want to acknowledge that because that's true, that means that sort of a straight approach to spending cuts isn't going to address those disparities. You're still going to have those costs hit some districts harder than others, even if the whole picture shrinks, right? And what I was starting to say earlier is this idea that those costs change over time too. This mental health services piece is a prime example of something that's really taken off in the last couple of years, and the demands are really different, and the cost for the services is really different from district to district. So even though we might have been addressing transportation for a long time, new costs come up that we then need to assess and see, is there a lot of disparity from district to district on this particular cost? And if so, how do we smooth it? And then on the last thing is that many of these cost drivers in FY25 are not quickly or easily solved, so they're likely to affect FY26, and they're largely out of district's control. I think probably people heard the news or read the letter, the December 1 letter talking about what's expected in FY26. And while that's not expected to be as big a jump as it was in FY25, still a recognition that there are some costs that are tough to solve, and that districts are really thinking about, a lot of school boards as they're working on their budgets now, are thinking about making cuts, recognizing that a lot of Vermonters are not going to be tolerant of another increase like FY25. So I want to spend the next few minutes sort of diving in. We have this what we're calling a 3-step plan, but I'm really going to focus on the first step primarily. That's what we're here to talk about today, because the steps 2 and 3 are sort of longer term and bigger work than just our work. But the 3 steps are: 1, provide immediate property tax relief to middle class Vermonters. And again, the reason we're focused on middle class Vermonters, and there is the low to middle class, low income to middle income Vermonters, the reason we're focused on the middle in particular is because they are the people hit the hardest. They are paying the largest share of their income in school taxes, and they are subject to these cliffs, which I'm going to kind of describe in a little more detail in a second. So we're really targeted on that piece, right? The second step is rebalancing the education fund. I'll touch quickly later on what I mean by that. And then completing the process of moving to income-based school taxes for all Vermont resident homeowners, and really recognizing that that will make the system much simpler and fairer and cause many fewer spikes, a lot fewer of these challenges, and a lot less confusion around what happens in your town versus another town, because all of that confusion and complication is really driven by the property tax side of the picture. So I want to describe how the property taxes or how school taxes are calculated now for resident homeowners. And so I don't know how familiar people are with this idea of the cliffs that we're talking about. So, but there's really kind of three levels that we think about where when you cross a certain income threshold, you're subject to different rules than you were a dollar ago, right? So I think that that's what we're talking about is these cliffs. And some are worse than others, but we want to just acknowledge them and describe them now. So people have probably heard the term circuit breaker, which is that $47,000 threshold below which your school taxes are a hard cap at a percentage of your income. They're not subject to the town rates. There's just a hard cap. And that $47,000 threshold, by the way, hasn't changed since we think 1985, but we definitely know it was well before Brigham, right? That number hasn't changed in a very long time. And then the next piece is that between 47 and 90,000, you're paying the household income rate. And then above 90,000, you're paying the household income rate plus a property share, the town property rate on any property value over 225,000. So you can see that if you cross that 90,000 threshold, you suddenly have this property piece that you didn't have before, a big chunk. I will acknowledge that on this right side here, homeowners under 90,000 also pay a property piece on anything above 400,000, but there aren't that many people in that situation. Although acknowledging that property values have grown quite a lot. In fact, Vermont has had the fastest growth of any state since the pandemic, and definitely in the last couple of years. So acknowledging that more and more properties are crossing those thresholds and falling into those categories so that more and more people are being subject to these rules than were before. But still a relatively small share of people who have incomes under 90,000 and property values above 400,000. Whereas you have many more who are right in that, who have property values above 225. So, again, a lot of properties in Vermont are above that $225,000 threshold. So if you're in that 90,000 household income range, you're likely to fall into that property tax piece of it. So just to give you a couple of like hard numbers illustrations, and all these are based on the FY25 average tax rate, so both the income rate and the average property rate. The average income rate in 25 was 2.56, and the average property rate was $1.31, which was lower than usual, largely because our property values have gone up so much, collectively. But just to show you, right, a dollar more in income leads to a $1,600 increase in your property tax bill. Right. So if you cross that threshold, there can be a pretty big jump. And that's for a pretty standard house, right? The median house value in Vermont is right around that 340 range. So, this is a pretty typical house in Vermont. And kind of walk through this a little bit more just to show you the cliffs. You don't need to look at all the numbers, but you get the idea, which is that for a slight, a dollar more in income, you're going to add this chunk and you can see a pretty big spike in your bill, even though the percentage of your income hasn't changed that much, hasn't grown that much, your bill can jump up quite a bit. So our proposal is to basically update a lot of these thresholds, mostly update them for inflation, but sort of adjust them to kind of where we are now, kind of triangulating sort of where, what's changed and property values and income. And so the three parts of it are add another step to the circuit breaker. So instead of 47,000, you have 60,000 and you cap it at 2.5. So between 47 and 60, you're capped at 2.5% of income or your town rate, whichever is lower. So just to give you a sense, in FY25, the town income rates range from 2% to 3.3%. So if you were crossing that $47,000 threshold, you could go from 2% of your income to 3.3. Here, we're just adding a step to kind of soften that. And so you go from 2.2 to 2.5 and then kind of ease it in a little bit more. Then we're updating that 90,000, and that $90,000 threshold hasn't been changed since 2008. So we're basically updating that for inflation, which gets you to about 130,000 in household income. Kind of try to recapture the same, that same share of homeowners that were captured under the 90,000 originally. So move that up to 130,000, meaning all those people would pay based on household income, and then we're also moving the property value threshold, right? So above 130,000, instead of paying an income property share on anything over 225, you're paying it on anything over 400,000. And you're only paying a property share below 130,000 in household income if your property value is more than $1 million. So again, kind of trying to update each of those thresholds. Doesn't mean we're completely eliminating the cliffs, but we are making many fewer Vermonters subject to them, and we're, really limiting the number of people, the number of homeowners that have incomes under 130,000 and a home value of more than $1 million is pretty small. So again, sort of update, again, the basic idea is to really kind of update these, bring them into the 21st century and update them for inflation, and really try to restore the purpose of income sensitivity to cover as many Vermonters and to cover the people really getting hit the hardest by school taxes. So that's the gist of the Cliffs reform, and I'm sure there's a lot of questions and we can dig into those in a minute, but just to briefly touch on the sort of step 2 and step 3 of our 3-step plan is, I want to just acknowledge what we mean when we say rebalance the education fund. In my mind, there are 3 categories of things that could happen to rebalance the education fund. One is on the expenditure side. Let's assess the expenditure side to ensure that those costs really belong in the education fund. And, obviously it's a lot of these things matter in terms of kids succeeding in school, the mental health services, we want to be able to provide them to kids. And school tends to be the best place to deliver those services to kids because that's where the kids are, right? But acknowledge is that the way it should be paid for, and acknowledge that the tax base is different for the education fund than it is for the general fund. And should mental health care be a part of the healthcare system and paid for in that way rather than being picked up by the schools? And again, falling on individual towns who who might be more rural, more removed from available services. Do we really want to see that kind of disparity? But part of it is just, do the costs belong in the education fund or not? Teachers' pensions is another one that has gone back and forth. There are times when we picked up some of that cost in the general fund, times when we picked it up in the ed fund. Let's decide, let's be clear about it, and let's be consistent from year to year. The second category is the revenue mix. So looking at the revenue side, is this the right amount of revenue? Is this how we want to do it? I think people have probably heard the expression that the residential and non-residential school taxes are shock absorbers, right? In other words, they expand to fit whatever we need to raise in the ed fund. And over time, they've picked up a bigger share of the total ed fund than they used to 20 years ago, right? So it was 60% of the ed fund 20 years ago. Now it's more like 2/3 of the ed fund. We tried to correct a little for that in 2018 when we got rid of the general fund transfer and instead dedicated all sales tax revenue toward the ed fund. But again, that mix keeps changing, and so it needs to be regularly evaluated. And part of the question is, if the shock absorber has to keep expanding faster than the rest of the revenue sources, then maybe that's not what we want to do. We want to keep them in proportion. And then the third category is what counts as education spending that affects your town tax rates directly, and what should be above the line costs that don't affect town tax rates. And just to illustrate what we mean by that, one of the ways, sort of what I was talking about at the beginning, one of the ways that we try to smooth the cost differences across districts is this, what I keep calling the orange hat, right? Like there are some costs that we take off the top that aren't counted as education spending. So you've got your total school budget, and some subset of that is your town's education spending that affects your town tax rates, because your town tax rates are set based on your per pupil spending, and that's your education spending divided by your pupils. But there are some costs that we take off the top, like transportation is a good one, where it doesn't affect each town. And this is one of the ways that we smooth these cost differences, by having the whole fund pick them up rather than counted on each town sort of education spending. So again, mental health services, if we decide to leave them in the education fund, it may make sense that we take it out of the ed spending, or take some piece of it out of the ed spending to kind of smooth some of those differences and not have them fall entirely on the town, each district or town. And then the third piece is move to income-based school taxes entirely. Again, so much of the confusion and frustration and jumps in the tax bills is driven by the property tax side of things. So an income-based system overall would make it much simpler and fairer. And we've been working toward it for 50 years, right? Over the years, we've gradually added, we started with seniors, we added low income people, and then we pretty much added everybody eligible for income sensitivity, although we still have this hybrid system where many of the highest income people pay based on property. But, we've been working toward that. Again, the income sensitivity piece has been eroded over time. But this ultimate solution is to have everybody pay based on income so that you don't have the regressivity and you don't have this problem of sort of the income sensitivity erosion. And just to highlight that, in particular, the regressivity of the system, you see that the people past income sensitivity, where they're paying based just on property value, and end up tending to spend less, a smaller share of their income in school taxes.